Okay, if everyone could find their seat. I would like to open this. Meeting. If you could go. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. First of all, good morning, Mr. Piketty. Good morning, members of parliament. Good morning, everybody in the audience, both here as well as in the Troelstrazaal, which is, I believe, next door. So, good morning and welcome, everybody. Well, as a neutral chairman for this meeting, which will last from now till 1 o'clock, I can only objectively observe that your book has stirred quite some debate in this country, and that's where I want to leave it as chairman of this meeting. And the questions and political weight, I leave that to the members of parliament. The order of this meeting is as follows: is first, I would like to first I'll give the floor to each of the members of parliament to introduce themselves, so that you know who you have in front of you when speaking with them about the book. I was thinking beforehand whether I would let you guess at the end which political party they were, but I want to ask them to state their name, but also the party they represent. After that, there's time for you to introduce your book and explain, so that will last a number of minutes. That's up to you.
Don't say that.
Not as much as the pages in the book. And after that, after your presentation, there will be time for questions by the members of parliament, and also for the people in the audience. The order for that is that each member asks one question in the first round. Mr. Piketty collects the points and can then answer the question, and a follow-up debate or discussion will follow probably automatically. And if there's time left, we'll do another round until we are at 1 o'clock. This presentation will be released on the internet as well, because there are people also watching at home or in their offices. That's at tweedekamer.nl. So for those interested, the presentation will be released, and it probably has been released now. My last point of order is that I would like to ask you not to take any more pictures or photographs for the remainder of this meeting. So I'm not speaking about the cameras, but the photographs. If you would like to stop that as from this moment. Apart from the press, is what I heard here. Okay, so. Having said that about the order, I would like to ask each of the members of parliament to introduce themselves briefly to Mr. Piketty and to the audience. So first to Mr. Klaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jesse Klaver and I'm a member of the Green Party.
My name is Mark Harbers. I'm financial spokesman for the Liberal Party for Freedom and Democracy.
I'm Arnold Merkies and I'm the financial spokesman for the Dutch Socialist Party. Good morning, I'm Henk Nijboer. I'm financial spokesman for the Labour Party.
Good morning, my name is Carola Schouten and I'm member of the Christian Union.
My name is Marianne Thieme. I'm the leader of the Animal Rights Party in the Netherlands, with a focus on our planet, animals, nature and the environment.
Good morning, my name is Wouter Koolmees, a member of D66, Liberal Democratic Party.
Morning, my name is Eddie van Heijem from the Christian Democrat Party.
Good morning, my name is Ed Groot. I'm in order of tax affairs for the Labour Party.
Okay, thank you. Then, Mr. Piketty, welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Let me first offer you, a copy of this book.
Thank you.
And let me also say that I am very honored to be here. Let me apologize for the fact that my English sounds a lot like French, and I'm sorry about this. I'm not very good with foreign language, and I do what I can. I hope this will be possible to understand me. I am extremely happy and honored to be here today and to respond to this invitation. I'm very glad that my book finally is out in the Netherlands. To be frank, I was very happy with the success of the book in the US, of course. But to be frank with you, I care a lot more about the European debate than about the American debate. And so, to me, the fact that the book is now out in the Netherlands, it came out in Germany a few weeks ago, in Italy, it will come out in Spain in a couple of weeks. Of course, it's very important because I think, this topic that I deal with in the book, is very important, not only in America, in North America, but also in Europe. The book is also coming out right now came out in China, in Korea, will come out in Japan in a few weeks. And I think there are different readings of the books that are possible in different parts of the world. The problem we have to solve in Europe are of course different from those that we have to solve in America. And so I'm very glad now to have the opportunity to present this book here in the Netherlands and to sort of discuss what can we learn from this, in particular for our European debates. So, in this presentation, I'm not going to give, an academic lecture about everything that's in the book, but I will try to convey, some of the message, some of the findings that are in the book. So let me, I'm going to show you a couple of slides just to make a little bit more concrete this presentation. But, I will try. Please, you should stop me. I think you said I should talk as much as I want, but I don't think this is a good idea because this would. As a teacher, I tend to speak for too long and too much, and so I think we say 20 minutes, and I should really stick to that. And please remind me, but I have a clock here, so I should be able to do that. Okay, so. What is this book? So, that's called Capital in the 21st Century, but, it's a little bit of an exaggeration because, it's a title that's here to make the book appealing. But in fact, it's talking more about the past than about the future, to be honest. And so this is primarily a book. So this book came out in about a year ago in France in September 2013. It came out in the English language in March 2014. This book is really a book about the history of income and wealth distribution. And so what I do primarily in this book is to put together a lot of historical evidence that had never been collected before and that we were able to collect with several dozen scholars from over 20 countries. And, I should really emphasize that this book, although I am the single author and I am the only one responsible for the mistakes that could be in the book. I am certainly not the only one responsible for the historical data that was collected in the book. So this comes from a very collective international data collection project that was not possible probably just 10 or 20 years ago because of the lack of proper information technologies, and now it is possible to collect historical data on income and wealth at a scale that was not possible before. So that doesn't mean that we know everything, we still know too little, but at least we know a little more than we used to. And so, this is a book mostly trying to draw the lessons from the history of income and wealth. But let me say very clearly that, I am much better at analyzing the past than the future. And so in part 4 of the book, so as you can see, the book has 4 parts, including part 4 about regulating capital in the 21st century. But, you can very well disagree with everything that's in part 4 and still find some interest in the historical narrative that's in part 1, 2, and 3. So, I have no problem if people disagree with some of the conclusion in part 4. We are in the social sciences. There are different ways to interpret history. The historical evidence that we have is still imperfect. my ultimate objective, is not to make everybody agree with my conclusion, but rather to help people to write their own part 4, their own conclusion. I think this history of income and wealth and is important because issues of inequality or issues about the public debt, we are talking a lot about the public debt in Europe these days. Well, we've already had big public debt crises in the past, sometimes even bigger than those we have today. And I think we all have a lot to learn from studying, the history, the comparative international history of inequality, capital, wealth, and public debt in order to derive a better solution for the future. So this book is not going to put an end to the violent fight about inequality. We will keep fighting, in particular in Parliament, but also in society in general, about inequality and taxation. It is so difficult to get millions of people to agree about a tax system, a budgetary system. It's a miracle that we don't fight for real about it and that we can have a peaceful democratic fight. So I don't expect that this is going to put an end to this violent discussion, but at least this book I think can contribute to a more informed public discussion about this issue. So in this presentation, I will present a number of results from the book, but of course I cannot present everything. The book relies on historical evidence from many countries. So you can find, all the graphs and series are available online at this web site, but I will only present some of the results today. So let me start by saying that this book is putting together two very different and complementary parts of data, one on income and one on wealth. And to a large extent, what the book is trying to do is to shift the attention from rising income inequality to rising wealth inequality. And I think, in the long run, the dynamics of wealth distribution and wealth accumulation are probably even more important than the dynamics of income distribution. But of course, both are important, both are related, because wealth partly comes from the accumulation of income, but wealth also involves inherited wealth. It also involves natural resources, which were not accumulated by anyone. So this is a more, wealth in a way is a more complex object than income. It is also more unequally distributed than income. This is true in the Netherlands, of course, but this is true in every country. The concentration of wealth, the inequality of wealth is always larger than the inequality of income, and in particular the inequality of labor income. So, this book is largely trying to shift the attention from the study of income to the study of wealth, but both are important. So the first part of the database that I use in this book comes from the World Top Income database. So the countries in red are already in the database. The countries in blue are about to enter the database. So what does it mean to be in the database? It means that we have tried to collect with my colleagues all the historical data that could be collected for a given country on income. So usually the oldest source of data on income comes from the income tax. So it's important to realize that taxation is always more than taxation. It's also a way to produce information. It's also a way to produce legal categories, statistical categories. So when you don't have an income tax, you know very little about income dynamics. And when you don't have a wealth tax, well, it's more difficult to know about wealth dynamics. And that's one of the reasons I sort of like wealth tax, is that you can produce information. And I think our democratic societies need information to have a proper informed debate. It's very difficult to have a reasonable debate about wealth inequality, if you don't have good data. Now, for income, if we didn't have the income tax, we would know much less about income inequalities than we do. So what we've done in the World Top Income database is to return to the oldest possible income tax data we could find in every country. So in the United States, income tax was created in 1913, in France in 1914. In most countries, it was created between 1900 and 1920, and this allows us to study the evolution of income inequality. So this is a work that, strangely enough, had never been done before, at least not to this scale. So in a way, what we've been doing is to extend and pursue a work that had been done in the US by Kuznets in the 1950s. So Kuznets was an American economist who was the first economist to compute national accounts for the US. And it's interesting to see that the next step, the next logical step after you are able to compute GDP and national income is to use the income tax data in order to compute the share in national income of the top 10% income, the bottom 90%, the evolution of the distribution. And all what we've done is to extend what he did in the 50s to over 20 countries over a century, which, as you can see immediately on this graph, the fact of having a longer run historical perspective changes quite a lot the view that you can have on this issue. So this is a simple graph, this is a simple example that we get from this World Top Income database. So this is the share of total national income, pre-tax, primary, labor and capital income, going to top 10% income holders in the United States. And so you can see a big decline in inequality in the first part of the century, and then a big increase in inequality in the recent decades. So as you can see, this is quite spectacular. So in the 1950s, 1960s, people had a much more optimistic view of the distribution, and there was this belief in the so-called Kuznets curve, which was the view that, in advanced stages of development, you have a natural decline of inequality and a stabilization at a lower level. Well, as you can see, in the recent decades, we've had this very big increase, which has completely reversed the evolution. So in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the fact that the share going to the top 10% is stable. So, what do these numbers mean? If you have between 30 and 35% of total national income going to the top 10%, and if this is stable in the 50s, 60s, 70s, this means that this is a period, the post-war period, where everybody benefits from growth in the same proportion. Okay, if you have a stable share going to the top 10%, it means that if you have a GDP growth rate of 3%, everybody benefits from 3%. The average income of the top 10 rises at 3%, the average income of the bottom 90 rises at 3%. So this is a balanced growth, ideal. So all what we need to care about is growth, and then everybody benefits from growth in the same proportion. Now, in the recent decades, unfortunately, the share going to the top 10% in the United States, went from 1/3 to 1/2. So I didn't, I stopped in 2010 on this graph because this is all I had when I wrote this book, but we now have the data for 2011, 2012, 2013, and this is now above 50%. This is 51, 52% in the US. So how far is this going to go? I think this is an important issue. This is more than a matter of just, a few people getting very rich at the top. When the share of national income in the largest economy in the world goes from 1/3 to 1/2, what this means is that over this time period, between 1980 and 2010, about 2/3 of aggregate economic growth in the US was absorbed in effect by the top 10%. So given that the aggregate performance of the US economy during this period was not particularly good, about 1.5, 1.7% in per capita GDP growth, if you have 2/3 of that going to the top, that's not a very good deal for the middle class and for the rest of society. And I think now most people believe that this has contributed not only to the stagnation of median incomes in the US during this time period, but probably also this has contributed to the rise of household debt, and this has contributed to make the financial system more fragile in the years coming to the crisis of 2007, 2008. So this is a serious issue. Now, in Europe, and in particular in the Netherlands and in France and in Germany, the rise of top income shares over this period has been much less important, much less extreme. So, this is not a reason to wait until it becomes as big as in the US to start worrying about it, but I think it's important to realize that, there are different ways to organize capitalism, there are different institutions, policy, and so there are different possible dynamics of inequality. So in Europe, you know, the welfare state, the social institutions, the fiscal system make the distribution of income and wealth less unequal than in the US. Although 1 century ago it was the opposite, you know, inequality was higher in Europe than in the US. So, you know, this all depends on the institutions and the policies that we choose. So now I would like to show you an evolution, another graph that I think is more important for Europe than for the US, which is the evolution of the capital to income ratio. So here you have it for Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. So, and you can see that, you know, so on this graph, what do you have? You have the evolution of the total value of private wealth. So this includes all the assets that are owned by private households, including real estate, business assets, financial assets, minus financial debt. And that's expressed as a fraction of national income, which is almost like a GDP, like a fraction of GDP. So you can see that until World War I, European societies, and it will be, you know, I'm sorry that I don't have the full historical series for the Netherlands, but it will probably look pretty similar. Until World War I, all European societies are what I call in the book, you know, patrimonial societies, in the sense that the total value of private wealth was between 6 and 7 years of national income, which is a lot. Now, following World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, you know, there was very little private wealth left in Europe in 1950 because of destruction, because of inflation, because also of nationalization and the fact that the government, you know, took control of a significant part of national wealth around 1950, 1960. Now, starting in the post-war period, you have this long process of recovery of private wealth to national income. If we now zoom on the recent period and look at more countries, so I'm going to show you another graph where instead of looking at the very long run, we are going to look at the 1970-2010 period. So here it is. So I'm sorry if you cannot read every country, but you have 8 countries, you know, the US, Japan, Germany, France, UK, Italy, Canada, and Australia. And again, I'm sorry that the Netherlands is not on the graph, but from the estimates I have seen for the Netherlands, you know, I think the evolution, it's clear that you also have an upward trend in the private wealth to income ratio in the Netherlands. So you can see that, you know, all of these countries, the ratio of private wealth to national income was between 2 and 3.5 years in 1970, and it's between 4 and 7 years in 2010. So you certainly have a big general rise. So how can we explain this? You know, according to economic textbook, this ratio of wealth to income or capital to output is sometimes assumed to be a constant. Well, you know, be careful with textbook. You know, sometimes in economics textbook, you know, when we don't have a lot of data, we just assume that it's a constant. And, you know, of course, if you only have one data point, everything is a constant. But as you can see, when we collect more data, which is what we've done in this work, you know, it's certainly not a constant. And in fact, there's no theoretical reason. There's no economic model that says that it should be a constant. You know, how much you accumulate wealth, how much you save, and many other economic dimensions and behavior determine the ratio of wealth to income, and this has no reason to be a constant. So the primary explanation for the rise in the wealth to income ratio is the fact that when you have growth slowdown, so at the end of the period, you know, in the 1990s, 2000, growth, particularly in Europe and in Japan, and particularly population growth, has become very small. And indeed, population growth is now close to zero or even negative in a number of countries, in Japan or Germany in particular. And it's only migration that makes population growth slightly positive or non-negative. It is almost unavoidable that the quantity of wealth accumulated in the past becomes bigger than in a country with very fast growth. So part of this return of a patrimonial society and this return of high wealth to income ratio comes from this slowdown of growth. And I should say very clearly that there's nothing bad about that. The fact that we have a high wealth-to-income ratio, in itself is certainly not bad. This has consequences about how we should think about our tax system. If you are in a time period where income is stagnating, and in particular wage income is stagnating, and wealth is doing very well, I think it's a matter of common sense, to tax labor income a bit less and wealth a bit more. I think it's an issue that goes beyond left and right. This is just a matter of common sense. But in itself, there is nothing bad of having a higher ratio of wealth to income. And in particular, I should mention that sometimes some people seem to have a very pessimistic or even apocalyptic reading of my book, and I'm very sad about that, because I have a much more optimistic view of the future and of the findings coming from my book. And in particular, one very positive message and optimistic conclusion for Europe that comes from my book is that, we've had a large rise in public debt in Europe over the past decades, but we've also had a very large rise in private wealth. And private wealth relative to GDP has increased a lot more than public debt has increased in proportion to GDP. So in other words, our national wealth, which is the sum of private and public wealth, has increased in the proportion of GDP. So in other words, we are rich. It is our governments which are poor, which creates a number of difficulties, as you may have noticed. But, it's a much better situation than if we were all poor. And, it's important to say that because, I don't know in the Netherlands, but in my country, in France, sometimes people feel that, we only have debt. We are being owned by the rest of the world, or by the Mars planet, or by the Emir of Qatar, or the Bank of China. So, some of our football clubs are owned by the Emir of Qatar, but so far, it's important to realize that Europe, if you take Europe as a whole, our private wealth to GDP ratio has never been higher for an entire century. And our net position with respect to the rest of the world is positive. Collectively, we own more financial assets in the rest of the world than the rest of the world in the Eurozone, which means in particular that our public debt is internal public debt, in the sense that the fraction of our public debt that is owned outside the Eurozone is less than the financial assets that we own in the rest of the world. And that's very important because, this offers all other sets of policy options that if we were being owned by the rest of the world. So this is, I think, a very important message to realize. So just to illustrate this, let me compare, and this will be the final graph I will show you. Let me compare the evolution of so this is private capital to GDP with the evolution of the public capital to GDP ratio. So this is the same graph as the previous one, except that I have put public capital in addition to private capital on the same graph. So what is public capital? Well, it is defined in the same way as private capital or private wealth. This is the sum of assets owned by the government. So, for instance, the value of this building or other, public buildings or financial assets owned by governments, minus their public debt. Okay? So this can be positive or negative. So you can see in Italy, well, you cannot see very well, but if you look at the black point in 2010 at the very bottom, well, this is Italy public wealth, and you can see that this is negative. So what does this mean that this is negative? Well, this means that the public debt in Italy is now bigger than the public assets. So even if the Italian government were to sell all the public buildings, all the public financial assets, that will not be enough to repay the public debt. Now, in the Netherlands or in France or in Germany or in the US, it will not be negative, but it will be very close to zero, in the sense that the value of public assets is typically 100% of GDP. The value of public debt is typically 100% of GDP, so the balance between the two is close to zero. And you can see that over this time period, so what do you see on this graph? First you see that public wealth has always been smaller than private wealth, which is not really a surprise. We don't live in the Soviet Union, but it's good to see it on a graph. At least and also what you can see, what's more important, is that over the time period you have a decline of public wealth and an increase in private wealth. So this simply corresponds to the fact that if you increase your public debt and you privatize some of your public assets, of course, if you have less public assets, more public debt, you have a decline in net public wealth. But what you can also see is that the rise in private wealth has been a lot bigger than the decline in public wealth. So again, this is the good news I told to you about. Well, I'm not saying everything is good news in the book and on this graph, but at least, even in the case of Italy, you can see that the increase in the private wealth to GDP ratio has been of the order of 4 years of national income, of the order of 4 years of GDP between 1970 and 2010, whereas the decline in public wealth has been of the order of 1 year of GDP. So, this transfer from public to private wealth is only about 1/4 of the increase in private wealth, if you want to state it this way. So, I'm not going to continue anymore, but all I want to say is that sometime when we look at our public debt problem, we only look at one side of the problem. We only look at the liability, at the debt side. I think it's important to have a broad view of the entire balance sheet of our societies and our countries, to look at the assets and not only at the debt. And, potentially this can have an impact on some of our policy debate in Europe right now. So, let me stop there, and, I'd be very happy to answer questions. Yep.
Okay, we'll turn to a first question round, and we'll go in this order. So first, Mr. Klaver.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Piketty, for your presentation, and thank you for being here, for your presence here. I think it's of great importance that we, as members of the Parliament, acquaint ourselves with the most recent scientific knowledge regarding important political themes, such as inequality. And as you stated, we keep fighting about inequality, and I think it's because of what you wrote in your book, because last decades there was not a lot of debate about the role of capital in our society. So I would like to thank you for that. In that matter, I have what you said was that it was common sense to tax wealth a little bit more and labor a little bit less. And in that matter, I have a question for you about progressive taxation. Progressive taxation is an important issue in your book. In the Netherlands, we have a progressive income tax, which taxes the wages that people earn. We have a flat tax system, you could say, for that income from capital, for instance, a return on equity or profit. My question for you is twofold. First, do you agree that income from capital should be treated in the same way as income from labor? And second, would it be wise to use a progressive tax for income that comes from capital? Is there... Okay. That's it?
Oh, the rules. Yeah, indeed. It was already smuggling.
It was worth trying. Yeah.
Mr. Harbers.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Piketty, and thank you for joining us today and for your presentation. My question is about the pension funds. Great proportion of Dutch private wealth is invested in collective pension funds, and lower and middle class Dutchmen benefit from this by receiving pension. And shouldn't this affect any analysis concerning wealth variation in the Netherlands? For instance, doesn't this private wealth make the Netherlands a more equal country? And consequently, shouldn't we be glad with wealth in the form of pension funds having a high return on capital?
Okay, thank you. Mr. Merkies.
Welcome, Mr. Piketty. We are very pleased to have you here. When I was reading the last part of your book, part 4, I thought as a scientist you would probably have made it much easier on yourself to skip this part and just do the first 3 parts, just stating the facts. But you didn't. You also have proposals. I think this very useful, and it's also a risky thing to do because half of the world is criticizing you because of your proposals. But I think it's important, especially for us politicians. As you might have heard, we're at the start of new reforms, fiscal reforms in the Netherlands. I read in your book you say at the heart of every major political upheaval lies a fiscal revolution. So it's quite important that we do this fiscal reform in the right way. And what you suggest, the most important suggestion you do is the global tax on capital, a progressive tax. At the same time, you say, well, we cannot achieve this overnight. So this is merely a reference point, I said, and you say, well, we could work towards this in a step-by-step plan, and especially say in Europe we could work towards this. We can make agreements. I would like to ask you, can you set out how this would work? How would we set out this plan in Europe, and can we also do things unilaterally in the Netherlands? Especially bearing in mind that in the Netherlands we have a very high inequality of wealth. We're the second in Europe. Thank you.
Mr. Nijboer.
Mr. Piketty, thank you very much for being here and putting inequality so high on the societal agenda. I think it's very important because it's one of the main challenging themes facing society today. And there are actually two ways to fight inequality. Through the tax system, and the Labour Party has also ideas about improving the tax system in that way. But that's actually a kind of repairing inequality. And isn't it the most important theme to prevent inequality? And you mention in your book that education is really important in that sense. But I want to put another kind of inequality on the agenda, that's socio-economic health. People die 7 years earlier than people who have low incomes, have 12 years in the Netherlands less health, less healthy life. And preventing that kind of inequality that people have, should that be much higher on the political agenda? And what can we do about that kind? So that's more prevention of inequality than repairing inequality. Should that be much higher on the agenda, and what can we do about it?
Thank you. Mrs. Schouten.
Thank you, Mr. Piketty, for your presentation. I have a lot of questions and I can only ask one. That's a pity. But one of the questions I have is that nowadays we are a society which is based on information technology. And also money runs around the world very easily. What does this mean for the way capital is, where the capital is in the countries? And also, in relation to your conclusions, you say, well, in the ideal situation, we need one tax system for the whole world. Well, I also want world peace. It's hard, I think. But is it possible for countries to fight the fact with a tax system that money goes very easily around the world? In other words, if we put a higher tax rate here in the Netherlands, people can put their money in another country where the tax system is different. How can we fight that, except for the fact that we need one tax system, which is quite hard, I think.
Thank you. Mrs. Thieme.
Thank you, Mr. Piketty, for your presentation and for being here. In your book, the key issue is money, but wouldn't taxing natural resources instead of labor be a more significant tool for a comprehensive approach in addressing the systemic crisis? Shouldn't we shift our focus on money and export and traditional income tax tools into focus on social innovation, redefinition of the GDP, and a tax on natural resources? Thank you.
Mr. Koolmees.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Piketty, for your interesting presentation and your interesting book. One of your central points in the book is the law, I call it the law, that return on capital is higher than the rate of growth. And in your book, in chapter 10, you say, I take this to be a historical fact, not a logical necessity. And then you also show in figure tempo 10 that this law is not the case in the 20th century. That the real rate on capital is lower than the growth rate in the 20th century. So what assumptions underlie your prediction for the coming decades that the rate of return on capital will again be higher than the growth rate? Could you elaborate on that? Thank you.
Mr. Van Heijem.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Also, Mr. Piketty, thank you for being with us today. As my colleague said, your concern is rising inequality, and the underlying assumption is that the growth rate on capital exceeds the growth rate of the economy. And then the rather classical policy answer is a redistribution of wealth. But my question is, isn't the main problem that we have less economic growth because the tax rates on income and profit for middle-class working families and smaller firms, SMEs, are too high, and that many countries, France, for example, just an arbitrary example, of course, but are not willing to reform their welfare states to enhance growth. And as a compensation for this, our central banks have lowered their interest rates to stimulate the economy. And the result of this is booming stock markets and also a growth of capital as a result. So my question is, shouldn't we focus more on what the causes are of a lack of growth in Europe instead of starting with a debate on redistribution of wealth?
Thank you. Mr. Groot.
Yeah. Also, thanks for your presentation. I had the same question as Mr. Koolmees, but so I ask another question. To what extent do you believe in the power of democracy to reverse developments to larger inequality? I ask this because we have seen this trend in the United States, but also in Europe, where quite different political systems are. Could you reflect on that, on the power of democracy to do something against this inequality?
Thank you. And Mrs. Neperes.
Thank you. First, I want to apologize that I'm a little bit late, but I had to chair the parliament, so that was the reason. Not everybody can give this reason, but it's very important also for me as member of a parliament to meet you, Mr. Piketty. And then my question. We have in the Dutch tax system already a 1.2 tax and capital per year, each year. Apart from other taxes, we also have a lot of other taxes. Doesn't this make already our Netherlands system Piketty-proof already?
Okay, thank you. Quite diverse questions. Would you like to have a few moments to organize? And we'll just break for a few minutes if you want. No, that's okay. Yeah, okay, then the floor is yours.
So how long do you want me to... how much time do you...
Now, let's agree that because these questions will take as long as we need. 1 o'clock is the final moment, yeah. But also it might be possible that if one of the members wants to drill a little bit further into the points you're making, then there is the space to do that to a certain extent. Yeah? So it will automatically evolve, I hope.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for all these questions, and I would love to be able to answer them all, but these are very difficult and important questions. Let me maybe organize my answers by starting from the most sort of historical or theoretical question, for instance, about R versus G, the rate of return and the growth rate, and then move on to the Netherlands and Europe and what can we do and what would wealth tax or tax reform or welfare reform, what the central bank and sort of more policy issues. But first, let me start with the more sort of historical and theoretical broader questions, and in particular, let me try to be clear about this issue of what's really the meaning and the implication of R bigger than G and the rate of return to capital bigger than the growth rate. So let me first say very clearly that this mechanism R bigger than G is only one of the many mechanisms that I am studying in the book. So in particular, what I show in the book is that the most powerful force to reduce inequality in the long run is first, investment in education and very inclusive investment in education. This is really the diffusion of skills and knowledge, and education is the primary mechanism that can reduce inequality both between countries. This is what we have today with emerging countries catching up with rich countries. This can also work within countries if we have educational institution and social institution in the health domain as well that are sufficiently inclusive and that allow broad groups to access the right skills. And you know, at the end of the day, that's a lot more important than R bigger than G. And so yeah, I try to show that in the book. Now, coming back to R bigger than G, and which is more important for wealth inequality than for the inequality of labor income. You know, if you want, the inequality of labor income is more determined by the educational institution, social institution, labor market institution, and the concentration of property. Here, this is where R bigger than G can matter. So let's you know, hold on a little bit and see, you know, what does this mean? You know, let me first make very clear that during most of human history, R bigger than G was entirely obvious. You know, it was entirely obvious because the growth rate was close to zero. So if you open, you know, any novel of Jane Austen or Balzac, or, you know, I don't know as well about the literature in the Netherlands, but I'm sure that if you take any novel from the 18th century and the 19th century, you know, it's really obvious to the novelist and to the reader that R was bigger than G. I mean, it was not written this way, but this was really obvious because G, again, was very close to 0%. You know, the population growth, productivity growth until the 18th century was less than 0.1% per year, maybe, very close to zero. The rate of return, of course, was not zero. The rate of return, everybody, for instance, every reader of Jane Austen knows that, you know, the rate of return on land or the public debt was typically 5% per year. So if you want an annual income of £1,000, you need a capital of about £20,000 because 5% of 20,000 is going to give you 1,000. And it is so obvious to everybody that the novelists, they don't even have to explain it. You know, it's in the same paragraph. They will move from the yearly income to the capital value doing the 5% computation without explaining it because every reader knows it. So this was really in a way, this was the very basis of society because this is what allowed a group of owners to live off their wealth and to do other things in life than to care about their own survival. And to, you know, they could devote time to literary activities or scientific activities or go to the ballroom or do war or whatever they want to do. And you know, I think this is really the primary foundation of the very high and persistently high concentration of wealth that we have in pretty much every society until the 19th century, until World War I. And in the Netherlands, just like in France or in Britain or in Germany, until World War I, you have a very high concentration of wealth. Typically, you have no middle class in wealth. You have 90% of national wealth belonging to the top 10% of population. So you have a small group in society, in fact, mostly the top 1%, living off their wealth, and the rest of society with no wealth. Now, one of the important findings of my book is that the modern industrial revolution and modern growth did not change this basic relationship between R and G as much as one might have expected. So, of course, the industrial revolution led to an increase in the rate of growth, you know, which used to be 0% until the 18th century. And then in the 19th century, it became, you know, maybe 1.5%. But at the same time, you know, the rate of return to capital, which used to be 4 or 5% in agrarian societies, went to 5 or 6% with the new forms of industrial investment. And, you know, the long-run rate of return on the stock market is closer to 6 or 7 or sometimes 8%. So at the end of the day, you know, the gap between R and G was not so much affected up until World War I by the Industrial Revolution. So you had a lot of innovation, you know, around 1900, 1910 in Europe, but the gap between R and G was almost as large as under the Ancien Régime. And, you know, that's very important because, you know, 1900, 1910 in Europe is a time, at the same time, you have very high inequality and you have a lot of innovation. You know, some people in the US, you know, were telling me, oh, you know, we don't care about pre-World War I European societies because these were, you know, stagnant agrarian societies. But, you know, look, 1900, 1910 is the time where we invent the automobile, the electricity, radios, the transatlantic. You know, I think that's at least as important as Facebook, you know. So you know, you have growth at that time. You have innovation. but the growth rate of productivity are 1.5% per year, which is already a lot, because this means that over a generation, over 30 years, you have between 1/3 and 1/2 of the economy that is being renewed. And, this requires quite a strong educational system to make sure that everybody finds a job and finds the right skills when you have 1/3 or 1/2 of the economy that is being renewed at each generation. But this is only 1.5% growth per year. And with a rate of return of 5-6%, the gap between the two implies that the concentration of wealth tends to stabilize at relatively high levels. Now, during the 20th century, the only reason, so you were referring to graph, well, let's look at it because, it's easier to, okay, so this is this one. But so it's important to realize that before graph 10.10, you have graph 10.9, which is this one. Now, that's important because what's the difference between the two? Well, the difference is called World War I, World War II, capital destruction, and the rise of big taxation to pay back for the war. So this is the difference between the two, and that's important to realize. So in the 20th century, the gap between R and G was reduced for a number of very unusual reasons. First, there was a very unusual reason which had to do with capital destruction due to World War I, World War II, which reduced the rate of return to capital. So this is the before tax, before destruction rate of return on the top. And now if you take into account the capital destruction and the taxation, then the rate of return drops below the growth rate. But of course, we don't want this to happen again. I don't think the war is, the right way to redistribute wealth. So without the war and without this destruction, the rate of return to capital would have remained at a much higher levels. The other unusual event during the 20th century is the very high growth performance of the post-war period. Between 1950 and 1980, particularly in Europe, including, of course, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in France, we had growth rate of 4-5% per year. Now, is this going to happen again? Well, I don't think so. I think we can certainly do better than what we do in Europe right now. We can get back to 1-2% in the long run, and that will be much better than 0%. But I don't think we are going to return, to 5% growth per year. I think 5% growth per year that we had in the 1950s, 60s, 70s had to do with the reconstruction period. So in a way, this was also the delayed impact of the war. In 1950s, the level of GDP per capita in continental Europe is very low, and we have to catch up with the US. And then, around 1980, when we reach the same level of per capita GDP as in the US, we start to grow at a much lower rate. And, the evidence is that in the long run, the growth rate of productivity, which determines in the end the growth rate of per capita GDP, is closer to 1.5% than to 5%. And 1.5% is already quite fast, but that's not enough to prevent the gap between R and G to be high. Now, let me give you another important ingredient to think about it, which is the fact that with financial deregulation, probably this has contributed to the rise of inequality in access to good financial returns. So, even if the average rate of return to capital is not that much higher than the growth rate, the average rate of return is really the average of very different rate of return. You have some people who get a return of which is very small, and some people who get returns that are much higher. And probably, financial deregulation has allowed large wealth portfolios to access very sophisticated financial products that allows them to access very high returns. So if you look here, I have shown you a table which is table 12.1, about the growth rate of very top wealth holders in the world in recent decades. So this comes from the Forbes ranking of billionaires. Let me say right away that this is not a very reliable data source. I would prefer. It's very sad that we have to read magazine to learn about wealth these days. I would prefer. It would be much better if we could read Eurostat publication or IMF publication or European Central Bank publication. But in fact, we would not find this data on the distribution of wealth and top wealth group in this official publication, which is very sad. Because, part of the reason is because during many years, international organizations like the IMF and sometimes national government as well were opposing automatic transmission of information about cross-border assets and international information. So it's very hard to have publicly reliable information about cross-border assets and wealth. And so, the data that we have, in particular, the household survey with self-reported information on wealth, it's useful for some purposes, but it's not so reliable for the top of the wealth distribution. So we have to do with what we have. And so according to these Forbes rankings, what we find over the recent decades is that the top wealth holders, have been rising 3-4 times faster than the middle class, and in fact, than the size of the world economy. What's quite striking on this table 12.1 is that this is not only for Europe or for the US, this is for the entire world. So this takes into account emerging countries, China, India, but even at the level of the entire world, in spite of the convergence process between emerging countries and rich countries, inequality is rising in terms of the wealth distribution, in the sense that the top wealth holders are rising 3-4 times faster than average wealth. Now, of course, this cannot continue forever, and I'm not saying this will continue forever. If this was to continue for another 30 or 40 years, the share of national wealth or world wealth going to billionaires will go to 100%. So I'm not saying this is going to happen. I think nobody knows where this is going to stop, and I think this is a problem per se. And I think it's important to have democratic institutions that allow us to at least better know what's happening to the distribution of wealth, and then we can adapt our policies to whatever evolution we have. So let me now come back to these policy implications, in particular in the Netherlands and in Europe, and let me return to the list of questions and try to sort of give more concrete answer to the questions that were asked. So, first, can we, should capital income be taxed in the same way as labor income, and what can we do in Europe regarding progressive taxation? And there was also a very interesting questions about the measurement of wealth inequality in Europe, and in particular in the Netherlands with respect to pension funds. And maybe let me start with this question, this specific question on pension funds for the case of Netherlands, because I think that's very, very important. So, it's important to distinguish, of course, between pay-as-you-go pension and funded pensions, like what you have to a large extent in the Netherlands. So, pay-as-you-go pensions, unfunded pensions, are not included in the definition of wealth that I use in my book. If we were to include pay-as-you-go pension as part of the assets and the wealth of the household sector, then we also will need to count them as a liability for the government. So the national wealth figures that I have shown you before would not be affected by this. So in the case of the Netherlands, when you have funded pension, it's a bit different, of course. Then it looks more like wealth, and to some extent it will be preferable to try to include it in our estimate of the distribution of wealth. Now, the problem, of course, is that the value of the private pension to an individual depends in particular on his life expectancy. And there was a very interesting remark about the fact that the inequality in the real world also means very large inequality in life expectancy. So if at the age of 65, You have a gap in life expectancy of 10 years between the richest people and the poorest people. You can see that the value of the private pension is going to be very different. So that's difficult to measure. If we were to take this into account properly, at the end of the day, taking into account the private pension in the estimate of wealth inequality in the Netherlands, probably this will reduce the total inequality estimate somewhat, but probably not as much as one would expect because of this life expectancy effect. So, I'm not so sure, in fact. Maybe it will not reduce it at all, or probably it will reduce it a little bit. But, it's difficult because the gap in life expectancy can be really quite impressive. In any case, I think wealth inequality will still be very high in the Netherlands, just like in other European countries. I think the Netherlands is not particularly unequal as compared to other continental European countries, but in all of these countries, the concentration of wealth is very large as compared to the concentration of income. Also, I think the inclusion of private pension will not affect the trend in inequality. And the recent study in the Netherlands, suggests that there's been a rise in the share of total wealth going to top wealth holders, and I think this trend will still be there, if we were to include private pension in the analysis. So I think, again, I'm not saying the share of national wealth going to top wealth holders in the Netherlands or in France or in Europe is going to return to the same extreme level as in pre-World War I society. But I think it can keep increasing, for a long while. And this in itself is already worrying. And so I think what we really need in the Netherlands and elsewhere is to have more transparency about wealth dynamics, so that we know more about ourselves, we know more about where our societies are going, and so that we can adapt our policies and we can adapt our tax rate to that. So coming back to taxation, so what can we do, and is it easy for the Netherlands to have a progressive wealth tax on its own, without cooperation? Do we need a global government to do that? So, the truth is in between, I don't believe that a global government and, a global unified wealth tax is going to happen anytime soon. But, I think I think there's a lot, there's a lot that can be done even without a global government. I think, first of all, it's possible, it's important to be clear about the fact that most countries already have various forms of wealth tax, at the very least through a property tax. Okay? So in most countries, you have very heavy taxation of real estate property, but usually it's not progressive. Usually it's proportional to your real estate values, and it doesn't take into account financial debt. And I think it will be much better, and this could be done at the national level, to transform our system of property taxation that are proportional to property value, do not take into account financial debt, into progressive tax on net wealth. So for a given tax revenue, I'm not saying the total tax revenue from this should be increased, but take the tax revenue from the property tax. In Britain or in the US, the property tax are very large. In France also, I don't know too much about the Netherlands, but in many European countries, property tax are quite important. You could take the tax revenue as they are, but transform this into a progressive tax on net wealth, which will mean in practice that you will reduce the tax burden for the vast majority of the population that is trying to access wealth. So, if you have an apartment in Amsterdam that's worth, 500,000 euros, but if you have a debt liability of 450,000 euros, you're not very rich. Your net wealth is only 50,000 euros, and with the progressive tax on net wealth I have in mind, you will not pay any tax or very small tax. Whereas if you have, 1 million or 5 million in net wealth, then you would pay more. And that will be a way to increase wealth mobility. So the problem is not to reduce wealth accumulation. as I said, the fact that we have a high wealth to income ratio, that's very good. It's better to have capital. I like capital and wealth a lot. I like it so much that I would like more people to access wealth and capital. And so a progressive tax on wealth is a way to increase wealth mobility. And to a large extent, this can be done at a national level, at least up to a certain point. Now, if you want to have higher tax rate on very large financial portfolio, then indeed you need more international cooperation. So you don't need a global government, but certainly you need more. Okay. Certainly you need more European cooperation. Now, is this easy? No. Is this impossible? No. I think we can make progress, and I think it's very sad that we had to wait for the US sanctions on Swiss banks to start making a little bit of progress in the direction of financial transparency and automatic transmission of information in Europe. I think we should have been able to solve the problem on our own. I think France, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy are much more concerned by bank secrecy in Switzerland than the US. Well, look, in my country, the budget minister, Cahuzac, had a bank account in Switzerland, and even the president was not aware of it. And the budget minister thought that he could do away with it forever. He was in charge of taxation in our own country, and he was not paying tax on his bank account in Switzerland. So, this is a very sad situation that we are not able to solve this problem. But I think we could do it. I want to look at this recent episode on Swiss banks and bank secrecy in an optimistic manner, which is that if you put the right sanctions, all what happened is that the US government said, okay, if you don't want to cooperate, you will not have your banking license in the US anymore. And then suddenly the Swiss government changed their view. So what this shows is that, we need a more pragmatic approach with a more pragmatic approach to sanctions. It's not enough just to ask politely to tax haven to stop being a tax havens and to ask people who benefit from financial opacity to stop benefiting from financial opacity. We need to put sanctions that are in line with the benefits that some people are getting from financial opacity. And so, I think we could do a lot better in Europe in these directions that we are doing right now. I think this also has to do with our European institution. I think the unanimity rule for fiscal affairs is a disaster. It's not possible to make progress on any issue. So I think, in particular for fighting tax havens or for, corporate taxation for large multinational corporations, we should delegate that kind of decision to a Eurozone parliament or to a parliament for all countries, that want to move in this direction. I think it's very strange that our small and medium-sized businesses end up paying a higher tax rate than large multinational corporations. That's very difficult to understand for normal people, but it will keep being this way as long as we have 18 different or 28 different in the European Union corporate tax law. And so, I think we need more, closer political and fiscal union in Europe if we want to make progress in this direction. So is this easy? No, but is this possible? Yes, I think we can do a lot better than what we've done so far in the past. I don't know how much further I should go. Maybe we can continue the discussion with more questions. Maybe one important question I did not answer was about natural resources and the evolution of natural capital. I conclude the book in the last chapter with the issue of natural resources and natural capital. Well, the issue of oil resources plays a big role throughout the book, and the distribution of oil resources it plays an important role. But what I mentioned at the end of the book is that, of course, the real issue in the long run is the damage to our natural capital and to our environment. And this is a much more serious problem than our public debt, because our public debt can be destroyed very easily. It is a purely nominal reality in our book, but this is a debt to ourselves. We are not indebted with the Mars planet, so it's very easy to solve. Whereas, if you have 2 more degrees on the planet, that will not be easy to solve. So I think, we should invest a lot more in clean technologies and in the environment than we are doing right now. And, I think if, in a way, these environmental problems that we have to address are a lot more complicated than our little financial problem and problem about financial transparency. So if we are not able to solve the simple ones, how are we going to do with the more complicated ones? So let me stop there for now on, or maybe regarding the growth strategy, and there was a question about growth rate and welfare reform and France and Europe. Well, I took it as a more general question about Europe than a question about France. I'm not responsible for what the French government is doing. Okay, so can we do better in terms of growth performance than what we have in Europe right now? Yes, we can do a lot better. Right now we are close to 0%, so it's and we can do more than that. I think to me probably the best strategy to increase growth in the long run in Europe is to invest more in education, innovation, higher education. And what makes me really sad right now, in Europe, is that we are putting more money into our interest payment for our public debt than what we are investing in our university system. And, in some countries, the gap can be really enormous. Take a country like Italy, they are paying like 6% of GDP in interest payment every year. And the total budget of their university system is less than 1% of GDP. Okay, so you are putting 6 times more tax revenue in paying back our public debt to ourselves than we are investing in the future skills of our children. So, then we can talk about labor market reform and changing the labor contract. And, sometimes that's important. But, as long, if you think that we can continue for many decades, putting so much money in interest payment without investing in the future, I think the only historical precedent that I can see for such a strategy, which I describe in my book, is the example of Britain in the 19th century, where Britain came after the Napoleonic War with 2 years of GDP in public debt, 200% of GDP. So it was twice as much as what we have in Europe today. And so what did they do to reduce this public debt? Well, at that time there was no inflation, so 0% inflation. It was the gold standard. The growth rate was positive, but it was not 5% per year. It was 1-2% per year. So what they did is that they had budget surplus. They had 1-2-3% of GDP in budget surplus. So it's like austerity today, if you want. You try to have budget surplus in order to reimburse your public debt. Now, the good news is that it did work. The bad news is that it took an entire century. So it took 100 years. During 100 years, there was 2-3% of GDP in budget surplus. And then in 1910, the public debt was back to 20-30% of GDP. Now, the only problem is that during an entire century, the British taxpayer put more money into paying back interest to their own rentiers. And, you can see rentiers in Jane Austen, but you can also see them in the money that the British taxpayers were putting. So they were putting more money into this interest payments than into their entire education system. The entire education system got less than 1% of GDP in the 19th century Britain. And, many people now, I think, believe that maybe it was not the best strategy to prepare for the 20th century, and that the part of the decline in the labor productivity of Britain in the 20th century came from this underinvestment in education and skills. And I'm very concerned that we do the same today in Europe, where we put less money into our university systems than we put in our interest payments. So in the 20th century, there were other example of very large public debt. So, you know, in 1945, you also have 200% of GDP in public debt in countries like France or Germany. And then in 1950, we are back to almost zero, 20% of GDP. So what happened between 1945 and 1950? Well, you know, the Germans and the French did not pay back their public debt. You know, we got rid of them through inflation and through debt repudiation. You know, in the post-war agreement, you know, a big part of the German public debt was cancelled, and a big part of the French public debt was destroyed by inflation. You know, you had 50% inflation in 46, 47, 48, 49. So, you know, there's no public debt anymore in 1950. And, you know, this was much easier to pay for reconstruction in 1950 and 1960 without a public debt in Germany and France. You know, to invest in infrastructure, to invest in education, to invest in health. You know, if we had to pay back this public debt of 200% of GDP through budget surplus of 2% of GDP per year, you know, we would still be paying it. So, you know, Germany and France are the two countries that never paid back their big public debt, you know, unlike Britain in the 19th century. And now, you know, these are the two countries explaining to Southern Europe that, you know, they should pay it back with 6% interest rate. And, you know, I think, you know, this makes no sense at all. You know, we should be more aware of history. And, you know, one big lesson of history is that if you want to reduce a public debt of 100% of GDP or 200% of GDP with zero inflation, very low growth, just by accumulating budget surplus, you know, this takes decades and decades and decades. Now, is our public opinion ready for that? You know, I don't think so. So I'm not saying inflation is the best option. You know, I think, you know, progressive wealth tax in a way is the civilized form of inflation because, you know, this is doing the same as inflation except that you can protect the poor and the middle class and you can ask more to the rich. You know, one problem with inflation and generally speaking, one problem with monetary policy, which you very well mentioned, is that, you know, sometimes it does not benefit the right people. So, you know, right now we are asking a lot to our European Central Bank. But, you know, I think there are limits to what central banks can do. And, you know, creative monetary policy, you know, sometimes you don't really know what you're doing. You know, of course, it's easier to print billions of euros than to write a common corporate tax for Europe and to write a tax code because, you know, rewriting the tax code takes a parliament. You need people to agree. That's complicated. You know, so printing billions of euros is much easier. But sometimes you don't know what you do with the money. You know, you put it somewhere, you lend it to some banks, and then you end up, as you were saying, with some bubble on real estate, some bubble on particular financial assets, and then some people are making very large returns, but maybe these are not the right people. So I think, you know, in Europe and in the US, we've been asking too much to creative monetary policies in recent years, and we need to ask more now to fiscal policy, and in particular, to progressive taxation of wealth or other forms of taxation. You know, someone will have to pay for the public debt. You know, I'm just saying that it's better if you ask a bit more to, you know, people who have millions of euros than to people who are trying to access wealth and right now only have debt and mortgage and, you know, limited ability to access accumulation of wealth. So I can see that I have forgotten important questions, and I'm really sorry about that. You know, the health dimension of inequality is extremely important. You know, I mentioned it in the context of pension, the value of pension to different groups in the population, which varies a lot with life expectancy. But more generally, I think that, you know, the development of more inclusive social institution in terms of access to health, access to education is, you know, one of the most important way to reduce inequality. So, you know, access to education, just like access to health, remains far too unequal, you know, in our countries. Although we, you know, we probably have better health systems than almost anywhere else in the world, it's still much more difficult for you know, people from lower socio-economic backgrounds to access high-quality health or education services. So that's an extremely important issue. is the wealth tax in the Netherlands, is it already, how did you say it, Piketty proof, or is it already? No, I think it's not progressive enough. I think the problem is not so much to raise total tax revenue. I don't think we should raise total tax revenue in a country like the Netherlands or France. I think when you have 40% or 50% of GDP in total tax revenue, we don't want to get to 60 or 70. So I'm certainly not saying that. But I think that for total tax revenue, and in particular total capital tax revenue and wealth tax revenue, this could be made more progressive, in the sense that it could be lowered for the vast majority of the population that is trying to access wealth and has very little net wealth right now, and higher for people who have, more than 1 million, more than 2 million. So in my book, I give a very concrete example of that, where I say, you can have a tax rate, if you have a tax rate of 0% until 1 million euro in net wealth, 1% between 1 million and 5 million, and 2% above 5 million, that will be enough in the current European context to raise almost 2% of GDP in tax revenue. And that's because wealth is very concentrated, above 1 million and above 5 million. So you can protect the vast majority of the population and in fact reduce the tax burden for people who have very little wealth and who mostly have their labor income and still get a relatively high tax revenue. So finally, the power of democracy to reverse inequality. I try to develop, an optimistic, view in the book. But at the same time, of course, when you look at history, and in particular, if you look at the 20th century, I have to recognize, and the story that I tell in the book is pretty clear about that. I have to recognize that, sometimes things do not happen sort of as peacefully and as quietly that we would like them to happen. So in particular, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II played a very large role in the reduction of inequality in the past. But, I think we can do better next time. I think I'm very... in particular, I think sometimes there's a lot of hypocrisy with respect to equality. In particular, in my own country, in France, people like sometimes to describe France as a country of equality, etc. In fact, until World War I, France was really the very last country, one of the very last countries to adopt the income tax. In the summer of 1914, that was just 1 century ago. And unfortunately, this was not to pay for schools. This was to pay for the war, to go to war with Germany. And this was the only reason why the French Senate, at the end, accepted to adopt a progressive income tax. And it's interesting to remember, why is it that the French elite, and in particular the French Republican elite and economic and political elite, didn't want a progressive income or wealth tax in 1914. The view at that time in France was, okay, we have done the French Revolution. That's enough, basically. Because now we have people, we have equality of rights in front of the market. Everybody can become rich. We don't have aristocrats anymore. So Britain will need a progressive income tax or wealth tax because they are an aristocratic country. But in France, in 1914, the elite will say, we don't need an income tax. We are an egalitarian country because, we don't have aristocrats anymore. Except that in 1913, in fact, all the data that I show in my book, the inequality of wealth was just as extreme in France as in Britain. And the reason is that, at that time, aristocrat and lands, did not matter anymore. It's only in Downton Abbey that you have a lot of land in 1913. But in the real world, at that time, business assets, financial assets, foreign investment, real estate were a lot more important than land. But still, the inequality of wealth was as big as under the Ancien Régime. So the nature of wealth has been completely transformed, but the inequality of wealth. And there was a denial of the elite, not only in France but in other European countries, which is a bit depressing when you look at that. So I think I am very influenced, my overall thinking about these issues is very much influenced by this, the study of this period, because I think there's a lot in common between, what we sometimes call the first globalization between 1870 and 1914 and the globalization today. It's important to realize that we need to, it is only in 2000 or 2005 that we return to the same level of stock market capitalization relative to GDPs and what we had in Paris or London in 1913. So there's a lot in common in the two periods. And so do I believe in democracy and democratic outcome? Well, yeah, I am very much in favor of more, European political integration. And, I want to believe in a sort of political cooperation. Now, is it easy? Is this going to happen? I don't know. I think there is a serious risk that, if we don't change, in particular, our European institutions and policy, that, more and more people will feel that globalization is not working for them and will tend to go for, sort of nationalist solution. And this is a problem, certainly in my own country, in France, but I think throughout Europe. So I think it's important to show that globalization and market forces, which I very much believe in private property market forces, but I think it's important to show that they can come together with fiscal justice so that everybody can benefit from globalization in a more balanced manner than what we have now. Otherwise, there's a very serious risk that more and more people will turn against globalization. So we have to use whatever opportunity we have. And just to take a final example, we are going to have this negotiation on the European and American treaty, the US European Union treaty in the next year. I think it will be a very great opportunity to put a lot of, to show that globalization and trade liberalization can come together with fiscal justice. I think it would be a big mistake to put only trade liberalization in this treaty, because we already have we've had already a lot of trade liberalization in the past decades, and I think here we are putting half of the world GDP around the table. Okay, the US is about 1/4 of world GDP. The European Union is also about 1/4 of world GDP, although sometimes we tend to forget about it because it's a very divided quarter. So, we are putting the two around the table. That's half of the world GDP. So this is not the world government that we are talking about, but this is already something. So if we don't use this opportunity to have a minimal tax on large multinational corporations, to have automatic transmission of bank information, to have a global registry of financial assets, to what's the point of having half of the world GDP around the table? And I think there's a big demand in our public opinion, not only in Europe but also in the United States, to use this opportunity to show that globalization and fiscal justice can come together. So let me stop there.
Thank you for answering this first round. I think you've quite well answered the first set of questions. There is still, let's say, 25 minutes left. So are there other burning questions from the members? And I'll go from left to right again. Mr. Klaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Piketty, for all the answers and the inspiring way you are answering, and relaxed way, I would say, you are answering all these questions. Let me see where I can start. I keep it short, I'm sorry. When I understood you correct, you say it's actually not necessary for government to have the big debts there are now, and in that extent you also have some you criticize the fiscal and monetary policy now used in the European Union. In your book, you are writing about a structural or a one-time only European property tax between the 0.5% and 2% as a possible solution for the European debt crisis. Do I understand you correctly that in this particular case you suggest taxing capital instead of taxing the income from capital?
Mr. Harbers?
Yeah, thank you very much. You already mentioned social inclusion and the education system. But what role does the distribution of wealth play in your model? Because I think it's not a stabilized group of people. For instance, in the Netherlands, it showed that 70% of children with wealthy parents eventually did not end with in the group of highest incomes, and 70% of the wealth is owned by people whose parents were not wealthy, so-called new entrepreneurs. And don't you agree that we need these kind of incentives for entrepreneurs, for new entrepreneurs, to invest and to create jobs?
Mr. Merkies?
Thank you for all your answers. You said something about it's too bad that we sometimes have to gather information from magazines instead of the real sources. It reminded me of an article today about in the Netherlands where it says that the 10 richest people in the Netherlands, their wealth doubled in a decade from a little bit more than 12.5 billion to a little bit more than 25 billion. I think it's important to have to look at the resources, but how can we also make sure in the Netherlands that we get better resources? How can we do that worldwide? Are the common reporting standards, are they sufficient in this sense? And do we always only have to rely on tax data? Because the problem is when something is not taxed, then you cannot see it. So are there other ways to collect this data?
Mr. Nijboer.
Thank you very much for your clear and good answers in the first round. In the first question was about prevention, to prevent inequality, and now I want to ask a question about repairing inequality, and it's about wealth. You state clearly that wealth should be taxed proportionally, progressively. And my question is, couldn't we better tax wealth increases, real returns on capital? Because that's also the main point of your book, that real returns on capital, when you have a lot of capital, are higher than when you have no capital at all. There shouldn't be the system from a wealth tax, which is in the Netherlands, 1.2% on wealth, to wealth increase taxes. And wouldn't that solve the problem?
Mrs. Schouten.
Thank you also for answering the question. I have a question about your story about Europe. I think it's a bit of a double message you have. On the one hand, you say, I'm really promoting one fiscal union, a political, maybe, I think, in fiscal union. On the other hand, you admit that there are several countries that didn't meet, at least we didn't have a political union, but we made agreements and they didn't keep the agreements. So it's a matter of trust, if you can cooperate together in this aspect. And why are you so hopeful that we get enough trust to work together, also in respect of taxation?
Mrs. Thieme?
Well, thank you, Mr. Piketty, for your clear answers. Thank you for agreeing that the threat of losing natural capital is a bigger problem for our society than public debt, etc. The problem is that if economists still continue in finding solutions within a business-as-usual model, fully based on cheap natural resources, and a focus on economical growth, which causes also inequality, the contribution to solve the inequality in the world will turn out to be less effective, I think, than you wish to be. What's your comment on that?
Mr. Koolmees.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Piketty. First, I totally agree with you, with your conclusion about the importance of investment in education. Also to provide extra chances, but also to provide new growth in the European Union. But I want to come back to your analysis, and especially on the analysis on capital accumulation and the capital-income relation since the 1970s. You state it's not a bad case, and I agree with that because we are wealthier with each other. But I would say it's a logical case because we are in an aging society. So we have more older people, and older people save more and accumulate wealth more. Mr. Harbers asked about the pension funds. So in Netherlands, we socialized or institutionalized your law R bigger than G for the average worker throughout the pension funds. But is it also a logical development in aging Europe that capital accumulation is bigger and that we should try to incorporate this R bigger than G to prevent further inequalities. Could you respond on that? Thank you.
Mr. Van Heijem.
Yeah, thank you very much for answering my question. I have one additional question on the how to enhance growth, because, well, isn't it the case that the gap between R and G is not a natural fact? I mean, this is also influenced by policies. And do you agree with the, well, let's say, hypothesis that the current policies in Europe enhances the gap between R and G because of the lack of reforms, and also because the dependency on monetary policies, the low interest rates that favor the stock markets and the accumulation of wealth by capital. And this issue is not resolved by a shift in taxation on capital. So I really would like a more clear view on this issue.
Mr. Groot.
Thank you for all the answers, and I agree with you. We have now an historic opportunity to come to a treaty between the EU and the United States and the OECD to make a treaty in which fiscal justice and globalization are well balanced. We have seen last year's a race to the bottom with the corporate tax rates all over the world. Do you have an idea what the optimum corporate profit tax rate should be?
World level?
Mrs. Neperes.
Maybe, thank you for your answers. Maybe we can discuss another time more about Piketty proof. But I also have another question. We have in the Netherlands, but also in many other countries, already a lot of taxes on income and wealth. We have also inheritance tax. And now you propose a more progressive wealth tax. Is it reasonable that people pay 2 or 3, sometimes even 3 times tax about the same money, the same part of income?
Okay, thank you. No, please. The order is as explained. The members of Parliament ask questions, and Ms. Piketty will be in the Statenpassage in. I'm sorry. Could you, Mr. Okay, please. The floor is yours.
Okay. So let me maybe start from the questions about European Union and the fiscal union and more trust, and what do we do with countries like France that do not respect the rules they have agreed to, and yeah, I think it's a very serious problem. I think the problem that we have in our with our common currency system in Europe right now is very simple. The problem is that a common currency with 18 different public debt, 18 different interest rate, 18 different corporate tax, it's a system that does not work and that will never work. So it's as simple as that. And when you travel in the rest of the world and you talk to people in the US or in China, this is completely obvious. And everybody tells you, well, look, in the US, if the Federal Reserve Bank had to choose every morning between the public debt of Texas and the public debt of California and the public debt of New York and to compare the interest rate, this would be a big mess. And this is what you have. And, we've constructed a monster, in the sense that with the common currency, you lose the possibility to devalue your currency. Now, in exchange for this, you should access to a, common, predictable interest rate. But because we have this 18 different public debt, you don't have this, so you are in the worst possible situation. And I think so when I say we, I mean the countries with low interest rates, so this includes Germany, but this includes France, of course, and the Netherlands and other countries. We have been extremely selfish with respect to Southern Europe, in 2011, 2012. Basically, we have decided that we didn't want to share our low interest rate. So we thought, well, okay, we have 1%, 0%. They will pay 5%, 6%, 4%, and they have to pay. This is a divine act of God, if they have a higher interest rate. But, this has nothing to do with God. When you are in a monetary union and you have a 4% or 5% gap in interest rate, this means that over a 10-year period, the markets are expecting that there is a 50% probability that a country is going to get out or is not going to repudiate its debt. So this is not a normal situation. And even today, with the reduction of interest rate in Southern Europe, the gap is still incredibly high for a monetary union. So this means that this is not working. And this all started, you remember when the European Central Bank in 2009 said that, if there was a downgrading of the dotation of Greece, they will stop taking Greek bonds as collateral in the European Central Bank. So suddenly we were giving to notation agency who had been so bad at putting grades on private sector bonds, we were giving them the power to destroy our monetary union. So since then, the European Central Bank has taken a different stance and has done its job. But still, we are in a system where, I think we have managed, 4 years ago, we had the same unemployment rate as the US, the same level as public debt as the US. Now, unemployment has gone down in the United States. It has gone up enormously in Europe. Public debt, of course, did not decline in Europe as much as we might have wanted, because when you have, very high unemployment, very low growth, inflation that is close to zero, how do you want to reduce your public debt? So I think it's very clear that the way the crisis has been handled in the Eurozone has been a disaster. To make it short. Now, this disaster is not the fault of Germany or the fault of a particular country. It's the fault of every country together that have agreed to these rules, and then we don't respect them because these are rules that are too rigid. The problem, I think the real problem we have in Europe right now is that we don't, as you said, we don't trust each other and we don't want to trust democracy. And I think we are inventing these very rigid rules about the deficit because we don't want to trust what I would recommend, which will be that we should have, Eurozone parliament where each country is represented in proportion to its population. And this is the place where we should decide the proper level of the deficit and the proper level of, if we want to have an investment plan. This is a political decision that should be taken under majority rule. And, I think that if France and Italy and other countries were making this proposal, I think it will be very difficult for Germany to say no forever. Because, you cannot say no to everything. And if you don't want to trust majority decision-making, then, what's the point of having a common currency? I think it's the problem right now is that there's no France and Italy have not really made such a proposal. So the French government has said that he was in favor of putting together the public debt, but without making the proposal for a political union through a Eurozone parliament, which will be the way to decide for the common level of the deficit. I don't know how long it will take to get to a better decision. What is sure is that the current system, where we have this negotiation between the national government and the European Commission to decide the level of the deficit, is a disaster. This is not working at all. Everybody is unhappy. The countries that are not respecting the criterion, I can tell you, are very unhappy. Look at the European election result. The countries that are respecting them are very unhappy as well. Everybody is unhappy, and the economic performance of the Eurozone is very bad. And at the end of the day, everybody, even Germany has a much lower growth performance than Britain, that is outside the Eurozone. So, at some point, if this continues like this, we can another 5 years, I think it will not be possible forever just to say to those who want to exit the euro that this is not allowed. I think at some point it's important to show that we can make this work better, and I think this requires, more integration, but in a more democratic way. I think a Eurozone parliament working on the basis of, majority decision-making, which each country represented in proportion to its population, would have taken better decisions. And I think we will not have reduced the public deficit as fast as what we've tried to do, and we would have higher growth in the Eurozone, just like in the US or in the UK. There's no reason why we should have growth performance that is so bad in the Eurozone. And at the end of the day, we will reduce our public debt faster than what we have now. So, yeah, I trust European integration, but I think we need to do it through another, change in treaty. The good news is that we change treaties all the time. The treaties were changed in 2012 in 6 months, just before the French presidential election, which, is a bit strange way to do it. But, I think the good news is that we can change them again, and this is what we should be talking about. Okay, so this is about, about European policy and European context. Now, let me try to answer faster to the other question. So there was a couple of questions about the wealth tax versus income tax, and should we tax the stock of wealth? Should we tax the flow of capital income coming from wealth? I think we need to do both. I think there is a good argument for having a tax system that relies both on the stock of wealth and on the flow the flow return to wealth. The reason, there are several reasons for this. But probably the main, first we have tax on the stock of wealth at the time of transmission of wealth through inheritance tax. And I think almost everybody agrees that this is part of what the tax system should look like. This corresponds to a sort of meritocratic ideal that we have in many different societies, that money that you get through your own labor income should be taxed less than money from inheritance. Now the problem is that in practice this is not always the case, and these days when you get 50,000 euros through your labor income, you tend to be sometimes much more taxed than when you get it through inheritance, and I think this is not good. Now the inheritance tax is not enough, and you also want to have an annual tax on wealth and property for a number of reasons. One of the reasons, I think, is that at the time of inheritance, you don't know what the future return to your property will be. So, for instance, if I received an apartment in Paris worth 100,000 euros in 1972, nobody at that time knew that it would be worth 5 million euros today, and that the return would be 5 times annual minimum wage today. So it would have been a mistake for the tax system, just to have an enormous inheritance tax in 1972 and then zero tax in the next 4 decades. So it makes sense to have a mix between how much you tax at the time of inheritance and then how much you tax through an annual tax on wealth and property. And I think this has to be progressive because, wealth is very concentrated. And if you want to increase access to wealth and mobility in wealth, this you cannot treat in the same manner, someone who has 50,000 euros and 100,000 euros in property with someone who has several million euros. And I think, one of the failures, for instance, of the Monti government in Italy tried to introduce a wealth tax a few years ago. Now, the only problem is that they sort of invented a regressive wealth tax because it was, the tax rate on real estate was flat, but it was 8 times bigger than the tax rate on financial assets. So, in effect, someone with a little house in Italy worth 100,000 euros was paying a tax rate that was 8 times bigger than someone with millions of euros in financial portfolio. So, everybody in Brussels was saying that Monti was a genius of the public finance, but, the Italian electorate apparently did not agree, and the tax was suppressed right away. So I think this is a very good example where, there is a need to introduce a wealth tax in countries where you have very large wealth to GDP ratio. And I think in Italy and Spain today, given the huge level of private wealth to GDP, it will be crazy not to ask a little bit more to wealth. It's really common sense. But it's very difficult to do it if you don't have automatic transmission of financial information in Europe and without more fiscal coordination. So, we are asking the Greeks to improve their tax system and to make their wealthy taxpayers pay more tax. And, that's a very reasonable request because the Greek tax system is not working. But at the same time, we let wealthy Greek households transfer their financial assets to German banks and French banks without transferring the information to the Greek government. So, we are in a complete contradiction. So there are really limits to what national governments can do in Europe to tax wealth. You can do, it does not mean you cannot do anything, but you need more cooperation. You can do, look, it's interesting to see, I mentioned Monti. In Spain, it was the Rajoy government that reintroduced the progressive wealth tax that had been suspended by Zapatero. So you can see that sometimes in politics, people don't do what they expect when they are in opposition, and what they had planned when they were in opposition. Well, sometimes they don't really have a plan when they are in opposition. That can be the problem also. But in Britain, it's very interesting that the Conservative government, at some point criticized the mansion tax that was introduced by the Labour Party. The Labour Party introduced a 5% tax rate on all transactions for property above £1 million in Britain when they were in power. Initially, it was criticized. And then when Cameron came into power, he introduced a 7% tax rate for properties above £2 million. And in the next election in Britain, it's almost certain that every group will propose to have more progressive taxation of property values at the top end. Because, again, when you have high wealth groups that are doing very well, and, you can see that, in London, you can see that in Paris, it will be crazy not to ask a little bit more to this high wealth group. So, I think it's taxing the property when you have such large property values is a matter of common sense. What about entrepreneurs, mobility? Don't we need entrepreneurs and mobility? Yeah, of course we need entrepreneurs and mobility in Wales. And when I look at the Forbes rankings, you have lots of entrepreneurs at the very top, and that's very good. Now, that's not a reason for having the top wealth group rise permanently 3 times faster than the average. When I look at the growth rate for, the average wealth at the top, you have some people who are going, these are not the same people over time, because as you said, there is mobility. So you have some people who go down, some people who go up. But in principle, if we were in an equilibrium of the world distribution of wealth, or the national distribution of wealth, then the people coming down and the people coming up should equilibrate themselves so that the average growth rate at the top should be comparable, maybe not exactly the same, but comparable to the growth rate for the entire economy. And this is not what we're seeing. We're seeing that the top is rising 3-4 times faster than the average. So it's good to have entrepreneur, but you don't need you cannot have the top rising 3 or 4 times faster than the average for even if you have mobility. Now at the top of the list, you don't only have entrepreneurs. You also have various forms of oligarchs, oil oligarchs. You have, and you also have a lot of inherited wealth. In France, we have this at the top of the list. We have this famous lady, Liliane Bettencourt. Her father, Eugène Schuller, was a real entrepreneur. He founded L'Oréal, which is the world leader in cosmetics, and he invented a very useful product for the hair. To keep your hair, and that's extremely useful. That's all as useful as Facebook and Microsoft. Now, the only problem is that he founded L'Oréal in 1908, and he died in the 1950s, and she never worked. And, her wealth between 1990 and 2010 increased from 3 to 30 billion euros, exactly as fast as the wealth of Bill Gates. Which is very sad in a way, because we would all prefer, I think, the wealth of Bill Gates or Steve Jobs to grow faster than the wealth of Liliane, although she's certainly a very nice person, and I have nothing against her. But, we would like wealth but wealth is not only a matter of merit, and the dynamics of wealth above a certain levels sometimes reflect, the ability to get high financial returns. I have a table that I don't have time to show you, but where I look at the financial returns to large university endowments, table 12.2, where you can see that very large initial endowments can get very high returns, even without any entrepreneurial innovation or invention. So, I think we need to take these numbers seriously, and we cannot just assume that natural forces will keep that, at a reasonable level and at an optimal level in any meaningful sense. So, of course, we need entrepreneurs, we need new wealth. That's very useful, but we cannot have the top, rising 3 times faster than the middle class forever. Otherwise, the share of national wealth going to the middle class, will shrink. And this, I think, having a wealth middle class is good for our democracy. That's also good for our economy. The view, that we need extreme concentration of wealth to grow is excessive. I think we need some inequality to get the proper incentives to wealth, but you don't need extreme inequality. And one lesson of the 20th century that comes from my book is that, we don't need 19th century inequality to grow in the 21st century. We can have a large share of national wealth for the middle class and still have a dynamic and competitive economy. And there's a risk that this will not continue forever. So let me stop there, and I'm really sorry if I did not answer everything as well as I should have. Thanks a lot.
Before we close the meeting, first in terms of logistics and order, for the press, it's not possible to ask questions here in this room, but there is a possibility Mr. Piketty will go to the Statenpassage. So that's where you can have further conversation with him. Then at 1:30, so that's in 30 minutes sharp, there will be a following roundtable discussion with 4 eminent professors here in the Netherlands about distribution of wealth and income. So that's at 1:30 in this same room. So everyone is then also happily invited. With that, actually, Mr. Piketty, I would really like to thank you for coming here. Especially on my behalf, actually, your revealing insights about the French. It was... thank you very much for answering almost all the questions, and I wish you a lot of success in promotion of your book. Thank you.
Thank you. So